Over 18 months, I lent my best friend nearly $23,000 for medical bills and rent emergencies that turned out never to have existed. Money that was actually funding her secret 2-year affair with my husband. My name is Wilhelmina Ashgrove, and before this happened, I believed I understood the people I trusted and the life I had built. My best friend, Persimmon, called me crying 18 months ago and asked if I could lend her $8,000 for an emergency medical bill. She said her insurance had refused to cover. She sounded exhausted, embarrassed, and scared in the exact way that makes a request feel less like a favor and more like a crisis. And I did what I had always done with her. I said yes without hesitation. At the time, I did not think of it as a sacrifice. I thought of it as friendship. That was what made the whole thing so easy for her. Persimmon had been in my life since college, long enough that some people joked we had been attached at the hip before we even knew what being adults was supposed to look like. We had gotten through breakups together, ugly jobs together, family disappointments together, and all the awkward early years when neither of us had enough money to pretend otherwise. She had been my maid of honor at my wedding to Desmond 9 years ago. She was the one who had held my hands when I cried over my father's funeral, the one who knew which tea I drank when I could not sleep, the one who had once shown up on my doorstep with takeout and a bottle of cheap wine after a boss publicly humiliated me in front of my entire team. She was not just a friend. She was the friend, the kind people build entire adult identities around and then never imagine having to question. So when she said she needed money, I didn't ask for a detailed breakdown. I asked if she was all right. I asked where I should send it. She cried harder after that, thanked me over, and promised she would pay me back as soon as she could. I remember feeling almost guilty for how quickly I had agreed, because she sounded so ashamed already. I told her not to worry about it, that I had it covered, that she should focus on getting better. Within an hour, I had transferred the money to her account and set the conversation aside in the part of my brain reserved for things that were serious but manageable. That was 18 months ago. By the time everything fell apart, I had lent Persimmon money 3 more times. A car repair, she said. A rent shortfall, she said. Another medical bill, she said. Each request came with a different level of urgency, but the same basic shape. Something had gone wrong, something was expensive, she was embarrassed to ask, and she would make it right as soon as possible. Each time I told myself that close friends were supposed to help each other through hard stretches. Each time I reminded myself that not every crisis needed to be dramatized or doubted. Each time I wanted to believe that the woman I had known for 15 years was exactly who she had always seemed to be. In total, I lent her just under $23,000. That number still makes my stomach tighten, not because it would have ruined me, but because it should have been enough to make me ask harder questions. It was not a small inconvenience anymore. It was a pattern, and patterns are what people like me miss when we are too busy trusting the story in front of us. My name is Wilhelmina Ashgrove. I am 36 years old, and until this happened, I would have described myself as practical, generous, and maybe a little too willing to believe the best in people. I worked as a consultant, which meant I traveled about 1 week a month, usually for clients who wanted me on site for presentations, problem solving, and the sort of polished confidence they thought they could only get from someone who wore nice shoes and knew when to stay quiet in a boardroom. I was good at my job. I was good at managing details. I was good at noticing what other people missed in their own spreadsheets and schedules. I was not good at seeing what was happening inside my own marriage. The first crack came on a Thursday night in early spring. I had just come home from a work trip and was unloading my bag in the bedroom when Desmond asked how my week had gone. He was sitting on the edge of the bed with his laptop open, looking distracted in the way that had become increasingly normal over the past year. Not angry, not affectionate, just absent in a quiet, polished way that made him seem like he was physically present but mentally somewhere else. I told him the trip had been productive and then mentioned, almost offhand, that I had wired Persimmon some money earlier that day. I said it casually, the way you mentioned paying a utility bill or picking up groceries. Desmond's face changed. It was slight, gone almost as soon as I noticed it, but it was enough. A flicker, a tightening around the mouth, a quick, instinctive look that did not belong to a man who was hearing ordinary news about his wife helping her best friend. I remember asking, "What?" He looked up too quickly and said, "Nothing, just surprised she needed another loan." I let it go at the time, because that answer was reasonable enough on the surface. Persimmon had asked me for money before. Desmond had never loved the topic, mostly because he hated feeling as though our finances were being nickeled and deemed by anyone outside our marriage, but his reaction seemed more specific than that. I noticed it, filed it away, and tried not to give it too much meaning. Later that night, though, when he was asleep and I was staring at the dark ceiling, I kept replaying it. Not because I suspected an affair right away. I didn't. That would have been too dramatic, and my brain was not ready to leap to that conclusion. What bothered me was the mismatch. It was one of those tiny, unexplainable moments that tells you there is a shape under the surface of a story that doesn't fit what you've been told. He had not looked annoyed, he had not looked confused, he had looked caught. The next morning, I checked my banking app and looked at the transfers I had made to Persimmon over the past 18 months. 8,000, 5,000, 3,000, 4,000. And suddenly, because I was looking at the list all at once instead of one request at a time, I could see the shape of it. The repetition, the timing, the way the emergency seemed to arrive whenever a little more cash would have been useful to someone who had reasons to need cash quickly. Still, that alone was not enough to accuse anyone of anything. People have accidents, people have bills, people have bad months. I told myself not to become paranoid just because my husband had made a strange face over coffee and I had decided to build a theory out of it. But I also could not unsee it. So I did something I had never done before. I hired a private investigator. Her name was Marisol Vance, and she had the kind of direct, level expression that made it obvious she had no interest in comforting me. I respected that immediately. I didn't want someone to tell me I was overreacting. I wanted someone to tell me whether my instincts had caught on to something real. I gave Marisol Persimmon's name, Desmond's name, and the timeline of the 4 loans. I told her I needed to know whether they had any connection beyond the obvious social overlap of my husband and my best friend. I was careful with the language, partly because I still felt ridiculous saying it out loud, and partly because I didn't want to give the idea more power than it deserved. Marisol did not smile. She just wrote everything down and said she would start where the money started and follow it wherever it went. That sentence alone made me feel sick. The 3 weeks I waited for her to report back were some of the longest of my life. I went to work, I came home, I answered emails, I made dinner, I had ordinary conversations with Desmond about groceries, taxes, and whether we wanted to go see his sister that weekend. I kept speaking to Persimmon too, because if either of them noticed that I had started moving differently around them, they did not show it. Persimmon texted me pictures of a new blazer she had bought for work. She complained about a headache. She sent me a meme about women needing more sleep than men. Desmond kissed me goodbye one morning and told me he would be late at the office again. His hand stayed on the small of my back a little longer than usual, as if he were trying to act normal so hard that the effort itself was visible. I became obsessed with mundane details because they were easier than the alternative. When Marisol called, I was alone in my car after work, sitting in the parking lot and pretending I was about to drive home. She told me I should sit down before she continued. That was the moment I knew I was right to be afraid. Desmond and Persimmon had been involved for just over 2 years. I remember gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles hurt, because some part of my body thought this was the kind of news that might require me to keep from floating away. The affair had started before the first loan. Not after, not during some innocent overlap. Before, which meant every single emergency Persimmon had brought to me had happened while she was sleeping with my husband. There was no graceful way to understand that. Marisol kept speaking in the same calm, professional tone while I struggled to process the shape of the words. The relationship had mostly taken place during the weeks I traveled for work. They used hotel bars, late dinners, and one rental apartment across town that Persimmon had leased under her own name. Desmond had been there regularly, often on the very nights he told me he was working late or handling a last-minute client issue. Then Marisol said the other thing. The emergencies were fake. There was no medical bill at the hospital Persimmon had named. No car repair invoice matched the shop she had described. The rent issue had never existed, because Persimmon's own statements showed her rent had been paid on time. The money I had given her had not gone to doctors or mechanics or landlords. It had gone to hotel rooms, dinners, gifts, and eventually toward helping cover the apartment lease where she and Desmond met when they wanted privacy. I had unknowingly funded my husband's affair. Not with marital money in some abstract legal sense, though that would have been bad enough. With my own savings, with my own trust, with the money I had handed over because I believed my best friend was in trouble. I had to pull into a gas station parking spot because I started shaking so badly I couldn't keep myself steady. I sat there with both hands over my mouth and cried in hard, ugly bursts that made my chest ache. It was not just that Desmond had cheated. It was not even just that Persimmon had cheated with him. It was that they had made me a financier in my own betrayal. They had taken my kindness and turned it into a resource. That part, more than anything else, felt obscene. Once I could speak again, I called Marisol back and asked her to send everything she had. The report came in layers over the next day. Photos, timelines, bank traces, apartment records, surveillance summaries. It was all exact in that infuriating way evidence tends to be. Precise, cold, unarguable. There were pictures of Desmond entering Persimmon's building, Desmond leaving it, Persimmon buying groceries with cash I knew had originated in my transfer. Screenshots that showed odd overlaps between the nights he claimed to be working and the hours he spent with her. Marisol even found a pattern in the dates of my loans and the dates when the apartment payments were due. I was not dealing with coincidence, I was dealing with planning. That realization is what turned my grief into anger. Because grief was sadness, and sadness I could have understood. But planning meant they had thought about me. They had included me. They had used my affection as part of the mechanism. Someone had sat in that apartment with my money in hand and decided exactly what lie to tell me to make sure it would keep coming. I called in sick the next day. Then I called an attorney. Her name was Priscilla Nakamura, and unlike Marisol, she did not sound gentle enough to let me fall apart for long. She listened to me explain the loans, the affair, the investigator, and the financial trail, and when I finished, there was a brief silence on the line before she said, "You need to treat this as both a divorce matter and a fraud matter." That was the first time anyone had spoken to me like what had happened was not just emotionally devastating but structurally serious. I met Priscilla in person later that week with Marisol's report printed out in a neat stack so thick it looked ridiculous on the conference table. She went through the documentation with the kind of attention that makes you grateful and terrified at the same time. She marked notes in the margins, asked for copies of bank transfers, and had me walk her through every conversation I remembered having with Persimmon about each emergency. Then she told me something that surprised me. While emotional manipulation by a friend is not always easy to turn into a clean legal claim, the fabrications themselves mattered. If Persimmon had invented emergencies to obtain money under false pretenses, and if that could be documented, then there was a viable civil fraud and unjust enrichment case. She would not promise me the world, and I appreciated that. She told me what was likely, what was possible, and what would be difficult. I trusted her immediately because she did not pretend this was prettier than it was. The divorce, she said, would be painful but straightforward in the sense that Desmond's conduct had already been documented. The fraud case against Persimmon would require a separate presentation, but the paper trail was strong enough to make her think settlement was realistic. I remember staring at her and saying, "I don't even know where to start." Priscilla's answer was simple, "At the beginning, and then you stop when they do." So I started. I confronted Desmond first. I chose our kitchen table because I wanted a place that was ordinary enough to make it impossible for him to turn the conversation into drama. The morning light came through the window in pale strips, and for a second I hated the normality of the scene so much I almost canceled it all and asked him to leave without explanation. He came in holding coffee, looking sleepy and irritated in the way people do when they believe the world is going to ask nothing of them that day. I waited until he sat down. Then I put Marisol's report on the table. I told him I knew about Persimmon. I knew about the apartment. I knew about the timeline. I knew about the lies. I knew he had looked at me with fear when I mentioned lending her money, because he understood, on some level, how close the whole thing already was to falling apart. At first he said nothing. Then he rubbed his forehead and asked, "How much do you know?" That was not the answer of an innocent man. I told him everything. He did not deny the affair. He did not claim the evidence had been faked. He just sat there looking stunned, as if the discovery itself had surprised him even though he was the one who had built the lie with her. Eventually he said the affair had started during a difficult period in our marriage when he had felt lonely and had not known how to talk to me about it. He said it as though loneliness were an explanation, and not just a feeling. He said he and Persimmon had never meant to hurt me. He said it like intent canceled consequences. I remember asking him, very quietly, "And the money?" He looked away. That was enough. He admitted that Persimmon had told him she was borrowing from me, but insisted he had not known the full details of every request. He said he had assumed I knew and didn't mind. That answer was so transparently weak it almost made me laugh, though I was far too angry to do it. He had been in my home, in my bed, in my life for 9 years. He knew exactly how I responded to Persimmon's requests. He knew I never asked her for the details because I trusted her. The idea that he had somehow thought I was casually underwriting both her emergencies and his secret life was insulting even before it was absurd. He kept talking because people in trouble often mistake volume for sincerity. He said he was sorry. He said he was confused. He said he had not planned for things to become this serious. He said he never intended to leave me, which for some reason infuriated me even more than if he had, as though my role in all of this was to be the steady thing he could keep while enjoying the thrill of someone else. I asked him to leave the table. Then I asked him to leave the house. He looked at me as if that had not occurred to him. I said it again. He packed a bag that afternoon and stayed with his brother for the first few nights. I changed the locks the following week. Persimmon was harder in a different way, because I had known her longer and because she cried so convincingly that part of me almost hated myself for not being moved. I asked her to meet me at a coffee shop across town where no one would recognize us easily. I chose a table near the back, not because I wanted privacy exactly, but because I did not want our entire conversation reflected in the window for strangers to see. When she walked in, she looked nervous immediately. That gave me no comfort. It just told me she knew. I put the same report in front of her. The color drained from her face before she even opened it. She started apologizing almost immediately, tears coming fast enough that her mascara began to smudge at the edges. She said she had never meant for it to get this far. She said the first lie had started because she had been embarrassed to ask me directly for money to cover her life while things with Desmond became complicated. She said she had told herself I could afford it, that I had always been the stable one, the responsible one, the one who would probably say yes if the crisis sounded serious enough. That was the moment I understood how carefully she had thought about me, not as a person, as a function. I asked her if there had ever been a real emergency. She said no. I asked her if she had ever intended to pay me back before I found out. She hesitated and then said she had meant to. Eventually. I asked her if she had any idea how humiliating it was to realize I had been funding her affair with my husband. That was when she finally broke down in a way that looked real, though by then, I no longer trusted tears as evidence of honesty. She said she had not wanted to hurt me. I told her that was not the same as not hurting me. She admitted that the apartment had been for them, that the loans had helped cover it, that she had used the same details and the same tone with me every time, because it made the lie easier to carry. She even said, with a kind of sick self-awareness that made me want to stand up and leave, that she had known I would never approve of the relationship, so asking for money openly felt impossible. That part was almost more insulting than the cheating. She had known I would disapprove, and instead of stopping, she had simply hidden her affair inside a fake financial crisis, like it was a gift she was helping herself to. I didn't yell. I wanted to, but I was too tired. I just told her I would be speaking with my attorney, and that our friendship was over. She reached for my hand across the table, and I pulled away so fast the motion hurt my shoulder. That was the only physical thing she tried. Even that felt like a violation. I left the coffee shop and sat in my car for 10 full minutes before I could breathe normally. The divorce filing happened the same week. Priscilla moved quickly, and I was grateful for it. Once the paperwork was underway, the whole shape of my life started changing in practical ways that made the emotional damage feel even more real. We divided accounts, we documented assets, we photographed belongings, we made lists. Every item in the house suddenly felt like proof that a whole life had existed and was now being dismantled in an orderly legal stack. Desmond tried to be conciliatory at first. He said he wanted things to stay civil. He said he hoped we could part without making anyone look worse than they already did. That sentence made me laugh in a way that surprised both of us. He had no idea how little he got to define civility after what he had done. Priscilla structured the case to reflect what had happened over the full 2 years, not just the final reveal. She argued that Desmond's affair had not merely harmed the marriage emotionally, but had also drawn marital resources into a hidden scheme through the loans I had made to Persimmon, because there were texts, bank records, timing overlaps, and a paper trail showing the apartment payments. The court was willing to see the broader financial deception for what it was. That did not mean I got revenge. It meant I got something closer to fairness than I expected. The divorce finalized just under a year later. I won't pretend that was an easy year. It wasn't. It was a year of documents and depositions, of bad sleep and worse conversations, of seeing my life translated into language like equitable distribution and marital misconduct and financial disclosure. It was a year in which every ordinary task had a shadow attached to it. Buying toothpaste felt like a decision made by someone whose husband had been living a second life. Going to a restaurant where Desmond and I had once celebrated an anniversary felt like walking into the scene of a crime nobody else could see. But there were also small moments of regaining myself. The first time I signed my name after changing my mailing address, it felt like moving a stone that had been sitting on my chest for months. The first time I opened my bank app and saw no transfers to Persimmon, I felt an almost ridiculous rush of relief. The first time I slept through the night without waking up in a panic, I cried from exhaustion and gratitude at the same time. Priscilla also pursued the civil fraud claim against Persimmon. That case moved differently, because Persimmon did not have nearly the same leverage in the process. Marisol's documentation was brutal in its clarity. The fabricated medical bill could not be produced because it never existed. The car repair had no matching record. The rent issue was disproven by bank statements. The apartment lease was real, and so were the surveillance logs that showed Desmond's visits. Once those pieces were lined up, Persimmon realized she had no story left that could survive contact with the evidence. She settled. The amount she agreed to repay covered the full $23,000 plus interest, structured as a payment plan because she did not have the full sum available immediately. There was also a written acknowledgement of the fraud, the kind of document that can feel cold until you realize it is the only thing standing between you and later denial. I did not want to see her name again after that, but I was glad it was on paper. People reacted to the truth in the predictable and unpredictable ways people always do when a tidy social world fractures. Our mutual friend group divided faster than I expected. Some were furious on my behalf and cut both of them out immediately. A few said they had always sensed something off, though they had never had proof and had not wanted to seem judgmental. Others tried to stay neutral, which was their right, but it still stung. Neutrality sounds noble until you are the one whose marriage and friendship were being used as props in someone else's private arrangement. I told the ones who wanted to remain in the middle that they did not need to take sides in every conflict in the world. But if they were asking me to pretend this was just a messy misunderstanding, then they were asking too much. Most of them chose me. That mattered more than I can explain. Not because I needed an audience, but because betrayal has a way of making you wonder whether your own judgment is broken. When other people who knew us both looked at the evidence and said, plainly, that this was wrong, it helped stitch my reality back together. It helped me trust my own memory again. Still, none of that erased the grief. There is a specific kind of grief that comes from losing two people at once when one loss reveals the other. You do not just mourn the person you loved or the friend you thought you had. You mourn the version of yourself who believed in both of them. You mourn all the conversations that were not what they seemed. You mourn the inside jokes that now feel contaminated. You mourn holidays, dinners, trips, and private little habits that once felt comforting and now feel like evidence. I started therapy because I understood I could not simply outwork that feeling. My therapist was very good at letting me say the ugly version out loud. I said that I felt stupid. I said that I felt used. I said that I hated that part of me still wanted to ask how long they had been laughing at me behind my back. I said that I had spent years considering generosity one of my better traits, and now I wasn't sure whether I had been generous or just naive. She did not give me a cheerful answer. She told me generosity is not the problem. The problem is that trust can be exploited by people who know how to sound like need. That stayed with me. After the case is concluded, Priscilla told me something I had not really wanted to hear, but needed to. Fraud committed by someone inside an intimate relationship is often harder to spot than fraud from a stranger, because trust itself becomes part of the trap. Skepticism feels rude when someone has already earned a place in your life. Doubt feels like betrayal before you ever realize you are the one being betrayed. She said the whole thing might have continued much longer if not for that one flicker on Desmond's face. That tiny expression, that was what made me go back and think. That was what made me check the timeline. That was what made me call Marisol instead of dismissing my discomfort as me being overcautious. It is strange to think my life changed because one man looked worried for less than a second. But that is how a lot of terrible truths work. They do not arrive with thunder. They arrive as a pause, a hesitation, a sentence that doesn't land right, a look that lasts too long or not long enough. You tell yourself it's nothing because if it is something, then the whole world behind it has to be rebuilt. I still have the first text from Persimmon about the emergency medical bill. She wrote that she hated to ask, that she was embarrassed, that she would never burden me if she had any other choice, that her insurance had completely screwed her, and that she was freaking out a little. I remember exactly how I responded. Of course I'll help. Send me the details. I'm sorry it's happening. I saved that message for a long time because I could not decide whether it made me feel sad or angry or both. Now I keep it for a different reason. It reminds me how expertly a person can use the language of closeness to bypass all the defenses a stranger would never get past. It reminds me that my instinct to help was not wrong. The wrongness belonged to the people who decided to turn that instinct into a tool. There are things I still notice now in a way I didn't before. When someone asks me for money, I don't panic, but I do pause. When a story feels too clean, I ask one more question. When a person I trust reacts a little too quickly to an ordinary detail, I pay attention. I would like to say I've become colder, but that is not quite right. I have become more exact. There's a difference. I still help people when I can. I still believe most people are not trying to harm each other. I still think generosity matters. but I no longer confused generosity with self-erasure. The year after the divorce was final, I got a new phone number. That sounds like a small thing, but it felt ceremonial. I remember setting up the contact list and seeing the blank space where Persimmon's name would have gone if I had wanted to keep pretending. I didn't add it. I didn't transfer it from the old phone. I left that blank space exactly where it was. Then I took a deep breath and let it stay blank. Desmond tried to send one last message through his brother a few months later, saying he hoped I was doing better and that he regretted how everything ended. I didn't answer. I had already given him all the access to my life that he deserved. Persimmon, for her part, attempted a brief apology through a mutual friend, the kind of apology that usually means the person wants relief more than forgiveness. I declined to respond to that too. Forgiveness, I learned, is not the same thing as reopening a door. If anything good came out of this, it was that I now understand exactly what my trust looks like when it is healthy. It is not blind, it is not automatic. It is not a debt I owe to everyone who knows how to sound sincere. Real trust can survive a question. It can survive a pause. It can survive a request for proof. The people who deserve your generosity will not punish you for protecting yourself. That is the lesson I had to learn the hard way. I think often about the apartment lease Marisol found because it represents the whole thing so neatly. A place that existed for secrecy. A place paid for with lies. A place where my husband and my best friend met while I was out of town believing I was working toward the life we had built together. There is something almost unbearably ordinary about that detail. No grand spy story, no dramatic disguise, just paperwork, bank transfers, and enough selfishness to turn an ordinary rental into a private stage for betrayal. That is what made it possible to uncover, and what made it so hard to accept. The truth is usually less cinematic than the lie. It is also more devastating. One of the strangest parts of the aftermath was how many ordinary routines had to be relearned. I had to decide which side of the bed to sleep on. I had to separate the receipts in the junk drawer from the receipts that mattered. I had to remove Persimmon from the emergency contact section of my phone, and then realize I had no idea who should replace her there. I had to answer questions from people who wanted the broad version of what happened but were not prepared for the details when I gave them. I learned that some friendships are strongest at the level of sympathy, and weakest at the level of accountability. I also learned that grief does not stay in the shape you expect. Some days I missed the idea of being married more than I missed Desmond himself. Some days I felt guilty for being relieved that the secret was over. Some days I was angry at myself for not seeing it sooner, even though no amount of hindsight changes the fact that I had been acting in good faith the entire time. The mind likes to pretend that betrayal should have been obvious because then the pain feels controllable. In reality, people who lie well do not leave a clean trail. They leave small inconsistencies that only make sense after you already know where to look. I do not say any of that for sympathy. I say it because it is honest. I don't hate Persimmon every day anymore. That would be too simple. Most days I feel something worse than hate, which is the exhausted recognition that someone I loved was fully capable of seeing me clearly and still choosing to use me. Hate can burn itself out. Recognition just sits there. It becomes part of how you read the world afterward. As for Desmond, I think of him less often than I used to, which is its own kind of victory. He wanted the comfort of a marriage without the accountability of one. He wanted the thrill of being wanted without the inconvenience of honesty. He wanted me stable, faithful, and available, while he gave pieces of himself away to someone else. In the end, he got neither the marriage nor the secret life he thought he could preserve. That was not enough to restore what he broke, but it was enough to remind me that lies eventually create a shape you can't hide forever. If I had dismissed that first strange reaction, I sometimes wonder how long it would have gone on. Would Persimmon have kept asking for money? Would Desmond have gotten sloppier? Would I have eventually stumbled into the truth some other way, perhaps in a way that humiliated me even more? I'll never know. What I do know is that my life stopped being built on other people's stories the day I decided to investigate the one detail that didn't fit. That decision cost me a marriage and a best friend. It also gave me my own life back, before they could take any more of it.